A long time ago, when I was at school, I experienced a particular incident that long perplexed me. Now I understand. I won't go into the ins and outs of the incident itself, except to say that it involved a group of boys trying to hang me, and they got very close to succeeding in their objective of killing me. Children are innocent to an extent, so when I met some of them later on foolishly when I attended a reunion, I didn't have a go at them. There was no point, because they were different people. And it did teach me also the strange force of a mindless mob. Almost by definition, mobs are mindless. It must have been very thrilling for them. For me, it was an experience I wouldn't want to repeat. Fortunately, it didn't cause serious damage beyond turning me into a philosopher. My mother's greatest nightmare. But after that event, a couple of days later, the school was lined up in a room we called the concert hall. 5 or 6 lines of different houses, they call them squadrons, to be given a lecture. Now, I didn't attend that. The whole school did except for me, and I didn't know what was going on at the time. I was sent over to the carpenter's workshop. There was a fellow called Mr. Jenkins. We never used Christian names for staff. We never used Christian names amongst each other. We called them Christian names and not first names in those days. Anyway, workshop was a nice place. I always liked it. Always warm, with a pot of glue bubbling away on a little gas ring in the corner. And Mr. Jenkins was there, and he told me to make a mortise and tenon joint. I was in there for about half an hour, maybe a little longer. And this was the day after the Upper Fan disaster. And Jenkins turned to me and said, "You know, you're very lucky." I thought, yeah. I didn't really realise the enormity of what happened to me. You don't when you're 10. It's just, something has happened which is really very unpleasant. But there's very little reflection about injustice or anything else. And whereupon he gave me a mini lecture, a bit like I'm doing to you now in a way, saying, well, I should consider myself lucky. The world's not such a good place. It's very harsh. And the subtext was, with hindsight, maybe 60-odd years plus hindsight on my part, that I should keep my mouth shut. I was a troublemaker and rocking the boat. My type were in effect threatening their employment. Yeah, that's how it happened. I think many of the staff, quite rightly, felt that there was something very strange about that school, and many schools like it, where the children of the wealthy were sent, I think, to give their parents a chance to go on their normal social lives as they subcontracted out childhood for the care of others. And some of them didn't like being proxy parents. Certainly the carpenter didn't. There was another one at the school who we foolishly thought was free as a bee, which was the gardener, a man called Mr. Selwood. He dressed as a gardener did in those days. The uniform fell away in the mid-60s, maybe early 70s, just after I left. I left in 68, which was an old-fashioned, in effect, 3-piece suit made out of heavy material, including waistcoat, which he wore all the time. He would take his jacket off on hot days. Occasionally, if it was extremely hot, he might even remove the waistcoat. And he drove a thing called a Dennis motor mower, huge thing. We boys would do our prep in summer's evenings behind large plate glass windows looking out over playing fields, and there was Mr. Selwood, so we thought, free as a bee, buzzing up and down, on the giant Dennis motor mower. Little did we know, of course, that he was far from rich, and most of it lived hand to mouth, and his whole existence, and I think pride, depended on keeping that job down until he retired, which he did shortly after I left. So there was something oddly tribal about the way the staff behaved in response to my experience. You would have expected, certainly now, there might have been more of a fuss, but I still suspect things like that go on. I know it's far from unique to a private school because I recently met someone in Leominster who I've known in a sort of indirect way for a long time, and he described how he too was strung up. This time it was baler twine. In my case it was a sort of nylon speckled cord, and he was at a state school. They strung him up from those bars you have in gymnasiums, and he recounted how he went home, because he survived obviously, with a pronounced welt around his neck. His father asked him what had happened, and he said, "Oh yeah, I've been hung." And his father said, "Well, get on with life." Yeah, it's quite odd, isn't it? Times were very different, but in fact they haven't changed much. Bullying still goes on, and there's some pretty horrific stuff, as you can see, particularly with the divisive type of and confidence-destroying propaganda put out against some of the very poor working-class legacy children. It's still going on. The politicians have it in their blood. And with good reason, in a way. I mean, it's not right, but if you're thinking about power for its own sake, it makes a lot of sense to set the tribes against each other. The genius of the British political system was that it went from tribes to mini nations across the country into one, England, and then they sort of exported or expanded the tribalist approach. So it felt, certainly up until the mid-60s, that the United Kingdom was fundamentally one tribe. The feature of tribalism, particularly nasty one, there are many, but particularly nasty one, is where it is thought that a duty that should one of the members of your tribe be caught doing something criminal or illegal against someone in another tribe, however bad that crime, it is a duty of the tribe to protect them. Because solidarity, I hate that word, because it's actually has implications of enforcement of an unavoidable obligation, regardless whether the obligation is good or not. Solidarity is essential for tribes to work. It produces a sort of conformity to internal authority. That's fine and dandy to an extent, but it can cause the most appalling bloodshed, and has in the past, and it looks like it could well do today in what was the United Kingdom. It's in effect far from united now. There's been a consistent attempt to destroy legacy culture that spread across the United Kingdom that did hold it together. The sort of loyalty in the Second World War to fight my country right or wrong was essential for mass mobilisation, particularly of women also, to do what was perhaps the greatest thing the British Empire ever did, apart from commencing the abolition of slavery, which was to assist in the destruction of a brutal ideology, the artificial tribalism, you might call it, of Germany, of the time. The thing about the Second World War was it was triggered by an ideological conflict between what is loosely called left wing and right wing, AH and Stalin. And then the rest of the world collapsed and everyone started trying to kill each other. Ideology is a form of artificial tribalism. It's a mental tribalism, and it has very often very efficient ways of internal discipline. So if you don't toe ideological line, the possibility that you will pay dearly for it is very high. One of the features of it is that there's no nuance in sanction. So in a non-ideological legal system, if, for instance, you use a particularly unpleasant word once, only possibly in apostrophes to discuss it, you know what I'm talking about. The very breath of that word, the sound of it, is sufficient for you to be considered beyond the pale. I mean, in Soviet Russia, for instance, an off-colour joke, any joke at the expense of Stalin, was enough to possibly get you executed, certainly sent to Gulag, which was, in many cases, a form of slow-motion death. At the same time, if you killed a party official, you would be executed, possibly more swiftly, so it might be a smaller sanction to a very tiny extent. No nuance, no degree, no measure. A breach of the tiniest thing, it's ideologically incorrect. And the ideologues assume that because everything's connected together, it's a sort of logical structure. You get one tiny thing out and the whole thing collapses. And therefore the individual that makes that off-coloured joke or uses that unpleasant word or whatever, the proscribed words, one of them, then it's as good as killing people, so you don't need to be around here anymore. Ideology is quite evil. I don't use that word lightly, because essentially it is anti-human. Well, I wouldn't say necessarily anti-human, but if humanity gets in the way of its objective, which is survival of the theory itself, and survival of the system of imprisoning minds and in effect turning human beings, as far as social and political thinking is concerned, into robotic creatures or terrorizing them with fear. That is what it wants to maintain. Its power for its own sake, which drags you back again to the cliche of referring to Orwell and Winston being tortured by O'Brien, who laid it out very clearly. There's a lot of competition between left-wing and right-wingers about whether Orwell was one of them or not. The answer is Orwell perished for thought, changed his mind. He developed his thinking as he went along. For instance, he was disillusioned by his experience in the Spanish Civil War when he saw what was going on in the International Brigade and the way the Russian influence was really had an ideological direction. It wasn't interested in humanity at all. And the way some people were treated, which was very much a reflection of Stalin's style in Russia, where he later on, after the Second World War, continued war after the Nazis were defeated against his own people, an internal war. When Mao talked about a continuous revolution, he meant it. He was no fool. So, tribalism. In a country where you permit multiculturalism to the extent that it is not tempered by some form of compulsory integration, not necessarily compulsory, hopefully voluntary, but some form of integration sufficient so that democracy can work, trouble is soon going to happen. The principle of compromise for democracy is essential. Academics, of course, don't treat democracy seriously, so they don't even know or think of this sort of thing. They just dismiss it with a certain sort of arrogance which you'd associate with people who think that they're top dog. The principle of compromise is compromise can't exist without this. The cost of compromise must be always less than the cost of non-cooperation. So that assumes that certain things are shared, and you would lose those shared things if you stuck your heels in and said, I'm not going to go with the democratic majority. If there's sufficient shared, then there is what you might call a community, or more so, a society which is shared between those cultures. I don't believe multiculturalism essentially is impossible, but that has to be nuanced with the assumption that there are aspects, common aspects, which must exist between those cultures to enable compromise to happen. Otherwise, democracy crumbles and falls, possibly in a Platonic way, to tyranny. The Platonic approach assumes that democracy inevitably degrades into tyranny. That's just not true. Because where did democracy come from in the first place? But from an evolution from quasi-totalitarianism of things like the divine right of kings and so on and so forth, through the medieval period, in the UK case, or the English case, the English Civil War, on to the Glorious Revolution, and then on through the Reform Acts, the abolition of lords in the early 20th century, and then over the last 35, 40 years, the reverse gear has been slammed on, and we seem to be going back towards tribalism. It is an appalling degradation of society, and if you let tribalism go too far, society does crumble away into separate parts. So you get mini societies and effectively mini nations. They start off as ghettos and then they grow and grow and grow. And between these nations, because they're based on tribalism, my country right or wrong, conflict is almost inevitable. This is entirely down, I would say entirely, down to academic failure to respect and treat democracy seriously. They didn't learn the lesson of the Second World War, which was triggered by ideologues fighting for which political theory and which dictator was going to control Europe, and in the long term they thought the world. I mean, this is arrogance off a scale. Democracy isn't arrogant because it doesn't follow the idea that you can prescribe in advance a sort of heaven on earth, or a stepping stone to heaven after life, if you want a theocracy. It doesn't do that. It doesn't suggest that there's a clear pathway, a shining path, as the Peruvian communists called it, towards wonder and goodness and justice and end of want and respect for all and wonderful things. It doesn't do that. What it does, it works on the principle of engaging with society. It can do this because democracy respects contradiction and disagreement on the principle of compromise, and it engages with society, which is an abstraction, but which does not insist it has to be logical. There's a whole lot of stuff in society, we all know this. There's this non-logical. Logic is suspended, and that's quite important because society is highly sophisticated. It's not a logical construct at all. It does have logical parts in it and a lot of sense, as well as a lot of nonsense. Democracy engages with this unruly, chaotic abstraction, and from it, it gains as much sense to do the best in the circumstances, and it attempts to implement that. Now, as circumstances change, so this sort of what makes sense. You might call it a sort of dynamic utopia, constantly changes also. So what would have been a utopia in Thomas More's time would be social and political hell today. I mean, it's so obvious as to be almost mindlessly true. Meanwhile, democracy also, one of its duties, is to determine what human rights are, because they constantly change too in nature. Not all of them, but they do change. And then finally, it produces a rolling, it's aiming at a rolling utopia. And you get laws that are repealed and changed and improved and so on and so forth as you go along. Ideology doesn't do that. If the circumstances change, it just sticks to its guns. And consequently, law turns into contempt for itself, and also politics is in contempt of humanity. And that's what we're facing with Mr. Burnham today. It's really quite a frightening prospect. He is an ideologue of the first order, and he shows his contempt in his conceit. Yeah, he's a jolly nice chap. So was Boris Johnson, and Stalin used to love a joke or two too. That doesn't really cut much ice. Anyway, a bit of a grim one today, but tribalism is critical, and it should be respected for what it is. If it's just a family doing it, then society can handle that. But if it's a whole ethnic group doing that in an enclave, then trouble is on the way, and it needs to be headed off as soon as possible, because if you don't, mindless conflict is the order of the day. And I just don't think we need to let that happen. Bye for now.